Welcome, everybody, to part one of our next lecture, The First Civilizations. This lecture is the last of our Unit 1 lectures before your first exam, and it covers the period roughly from 5000 BCE to 1500 BCE. This is the time in world history now that the first civilizations of human invention will come into focus. And so one of the first things we're going to need to do is get a sense of context, because like other aspects of Homo sapiens history, including the first two globalizations, migration and agriculture, civilization now will become, in effect, the third globalization. Something that happens both locally in places like the Yucatan Peninsula, the southwest coast of South America, the Yangtze and Yellow River valleys of China, the Indus River Valley of what is now Pakistan, and in particular the two areas along with the Indus River Valley that we'll be looking at, the civilizations of Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq and the Nile River Valley of Egypt. So as I say, both local to certain global areas, but in total a global phenomenon now is civilization, the third globalization, as I said, of our species. One historian has referred to civilization as, quote, small islands of innovation. Your textbook author, Robert Strayer. Civilizations gradually absorbed, overran, or displaced people practicing other ways of living. Over the next 5,000 years, civilization as a unique kind of human community gradually encompassed ever larger numbers of people and extended over ever larger territories, even as particular civilizations rose, fell, revived, and changed. So what Strayer's saying here is that civilization was a new type of human community. And as we'll see, a new type of human community that put very different demands on the environment. And as such, it represented a departure not only from the early agricultural communities that preceded civilization, but from the much longer stretch of time, upwards of 240,000 years, wherein our species lived not in civilization or in agricultural communities, but as hunter-gatherers in foraging societies. So yeah, civilization is really just a way of measuring a new kind of human society that appears about 5,000 years ago. A global phenomenon with local practice. Here you see a list, the big six that historians typically refer to as representing the first six or so of the great ancient civilizations, beginning with Sumer in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE. Its near contemporary Egypt in the Nile River Valley, 3500 BCE. By the mid-third millennium, you got Harappa in the Indus River Valley of what is now Pakistan, and then some of the others we saw from the map, the Shah Kingdom of China by 2200 BCE in the Yellow River Valley of China, and Norte Chico in South America, the northwest coast of South America, perhaps even earlier than the Shah, and finally here the Olmec of the Yucatan Peninsula, modern-day Mexico and Guatemala. And you see an example of the monumental sculpture left behind by the Olmec peoples of Mexico the famous giant head statues. Keep in mind that civilization as a way of living is a very recent development in human history. And again, our pie chart shows that in the totality of Homo sapiens existence, about 250,000 years have we as particular forms of human beings lived on this earth. In the last 250,000 years, civilization makes its appearance only about 5,000 years ago. So on the chart here, this purple slice represents the total time of civilization since its origins about 5,000 years ago. And this thin black strand represents the more recent manifestation of civilization that we call the Industrial Revolution. So taken together, the last 5,000 years of civilization, including the more recent form of civilization, Industrial Revolution, altogether represents a mere fraction of the total time that our species has been on the earth. So yeah, a recent innovation. The oldest civilizations date back to 3500 BCE, meaning that mankind has possessed civilization for only 5,500 years out of our 250,000 years of human history, which equates to basically the last 2% of our history. And yet, though recent, something big was contained in this idea of civilization. And I think to understand it, we have to look at the term itself, which is susceptible to, I think, misunderstanding, really. What's in a name? Civilization. Well, the term is a Latin term. That is, our word civilization comes from its original Latin root, civitas, from which we get our English word cities. So I suppose the easiest way to think of civilization is as a type of urban society, that is, a city-based society with high concentrations of population living in fairly close space. And it's true, the early civilizations represented the greatest concentrations of population of human beings up to that time in our history. So far larger urban populations. And you can see from those early civilizations, like for example here, the Mohenjo-Daro civilization of the Indus River Valley, again of modern day Pakistan, which emerges in the third millennium, that is the 2000s BCE, so over 4,000 years ago. Mohenjo-Daro was an urban center nearby the Indus River, which saw monumental construction, urban construction of buildings and domiciles and residences and streets and temples of all kinds. And this picture, which shows an excavated section of Mohenjo-Daro, reminds us that first and foremost, civilization, from its root civitas, was an urban form of human society. And I think, if you allow me for just a second here to suggest, and your author Strayer does this at the end of the chapter, that often we use civilization as a kind of value-laden term to mean superior. To call someone, for example, uncivilized is an insult. It means that they lack refinement, lack sophistication, lack discipline. And we have tended to use the term that way to be a kind of pejorative or insult term directed at those to whom we feel superior. And by claiming that you are civilized, you're in effect claiming that you're superior. But these value-laden versions of the word we really need to set aside, because they represent more an ethnocentric judgment that says really more about well, ethnocentrism, about the chauvinism of a culture, than it does in an academic sense what a civilization either is or isn't. So again, let's just stick to the basics here. We're not saying that a civilization in history represents an inherently superior product, or that people who were therefore civilized were inherently superior to those who were, say, hunter-gatherers or foragers. We're just saying they lived together in cities. And as to whether that was a better arrangement for human beings than small communities of hunter-gatherers, that is, foragers, is a question for another day. But to keep it distinctive, we say civilization as an urban-based population, an urban-based society of people. And this is what we begin to see a little over 5,000 years ago in places like the Indus River Valley. Now, urban-based civilizations required a dramatically different relationship with the environment. And one of my favorite examples of how this was depicted in the ancient period is on the tomb painting here from an Egyptian government official named Nebamun. It's Nebamun's tomb from the 14th century BCE in Egypt, a colorful scene depicting life along the lower Nile Delta region of Egypt, the heartland of Egyptian civilization, showing Nebamun, who as a government official or royal vizier wished to be depicted as dominant over nature. So here's Nebamun standing astride on his riverboat, the teeming abundance of life of the lower Nile Valley, from the fish in the river to the marine birds, the great vegetation that proliferated in the delta. And in effect, the editorial comment of this scene was that man had conquered nature. Man had dominion over nature. Together, agriculture and civilization dramatically changed the way humans interacted with nature and the natural environment, as historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto calls, an ecology of civilization emerges, in which, far greater than ever before, man begins to modify the landscape around him, creating fields for planting, irrigation to deliver water, the chopping down of trees for lumber, and ultimately the excavation of entire areas, land areas, the excavation of entire land areas for the building of cities. Each step in this process toward civilization required an intensive reworking of the natural environment. The most obvious and lasting evidence of that are the monuments that through time, through the processes of weathering and erosion, have remained to leave us spellbound, be they the Great Pyramids of Egypt, or the giant Olmec heads of Mexico, or the excavated cities of Mohenjo-Daro. We still, even in our own 21st century time, look upon them with wonder. So much so that we tend to want to mystify or romanticize them and say that they represented lost races of people or alien builders. But no such mystification is necessary, because the process of erecting civilization and even the great monuments to civilization are quite familiar to us still today. Civilization was more than just reworking the environment. It was reworking human relationships, as the historians J.R. and William McNeill write in their book The Human Web. The rise of civilizations established connections among scores of thousands and then among millions of persons who necessarily remained strangers to one another. For the first time, key relationships and important everyday transactions routinely transcended the primary communities within which human beings had previously lived. With greater and greater frequency, city dwellers, villagers, migratory pastoralists, as well as increasingly marginalized hunters and gatherers, all had to deal with strangers somehow. For everyone within reach of civilization, a variable mix of voluntary exchange of goods and services with involuntary submission to plunder, rent, and taxes became inescapable entanglements of ordinary life. So quite a description here we have of civilization. And one of the things that stands out is that for the first time in human history, the great frequency of relationships between people will see strangers, that is, individuals who had no previous knowledge of each other or no personal knowledge of one another, interacting on a daily basis. And think about that. Think about how in your own life today, from the time you wake up and leave your home and make your way to work or school, and what you do while you're there, as you sit in traffic next to fellow commuters, the number of people around you are strangers to you. They are people with whom you have no personal or particular knowledge. And this is something we take for granted, of course, in our lives, but it's something that had never really existed until we get the scale of population concentrated in urban areas that we call civilization. So yeah, a new web of human connections built among people who really didn't know one another and thus had to resort, as the McNeils say, often to involuntary submission in order to get along. Something imposed, relationships that are imposed by powerful forces, basically from those who controlled the means of production, the military, and other sources of daily wealth and power. But we'll have more to say about that as we go. So civilization implied not only a new relationship to the environment, but a new relationship between people. And nowhere did this web of connection, this phenomenon we call civilization, nowhere did it appear earlier in history than the place we call Mesopotamia. As you see here on the map, the region that is focused around the two great rivers, the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, each of which flow from the mountains of Anatolia, modern Turkey, the waters that come from the snow melts of those regions, and wind their way down through the very dry, arid lands of southern Mesopotamia. Modern Iraq is this area now, but still now, as then, an often very dry, even desert region where the rivers finally drain into the Persian Gulf here. This region, the Greeks first called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a Greek word. Meso means middle in Greek. So the middle of the rivers, Potamia, think Potomac River in the United States. It's a Greek word for river. So between the rivers, Mesopotamia. Clustered together were these early civilizing settlements in a dry desert floodplain in the southern part of Mesopotamia here that we call Sumer, pronounced Sumer, the southern end of the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys. You see these rivers flowing into a delta, a marshy delta land before draining into the Persian Gulf, or at least they did 5,000 years ago. The topography has changed somewhat over time, but as the communities of Sumer were finding their way toward the status of civilization, they lived a kind of precarious existence between dry desert and marshy riverlands, and it was from this mixture that they would create the world's first great civilizations. Perhaps it's critical to understand that this was not just a coincidental location, but as I suggest here, being a kind of drainage basin for two great rivers, the soils The drainage soils of these two rivers full of what we call alluvial sediments, that is, sediments full of organic materials that mix with the dirt and the sand and the river muck to create some of the most fertile agricultural soils anywhere in the ancient world. And so, again, don't want to lose sight of the fact that civilizations ultimately will rest on the ability of man to manipulate the environment. And the first manipulation, the first and foremost, would be the development of agriculture to support these new populations of people. So in some ways it might seem that this was an unlikely venue, this parched, arid land that bounded the wet, mucky, marshy, alluvial delta lands of the Tigris and Euphrates. It seems certainly that this was a land where nature made its own demands on the living inhabitants. And it was from this mix that humans engineered a new way of interacting with an environment, a new ecology of interacting called civilization. Dry, parched, arid region, the kind of place that the camels might find hospitable. Somehow it was from this region that a civilization would be created. And it was never an easy prospect. And we look back at some of the ancient writings of Mesopotamia and the ancient proverbs of the land. Will seed grow? Will seed grow? Asked an ancient Mesopotamian proverb. The answer, simply, we do not know. Almost like a haiku poem, this simple statement really betrayed the anxiety of the early inhabitants of Sumer over the precarious nature of the environment itself. Desert sandstorms, then as now, could easily kill the crops that the farmers coaxed from the ground. Flooding of the rivers could destroy fields of grain. And so from the beginning, the peoples of Sumer had to live with a kind of fatalism, you might say, a recognition that what nature gave, nature could take away. Seen from the satellite view, it's even, I think, a bit more dramatic. You see here the Tigris and Euphrates river basin that flows down from the mountains to the north. In the center here is the region, and along this periphery, where the early inhabitants of Sumer will find their ecology. Again, defined ecology is as the interactions of humans with their environment, the way humans interact with their environment. Or, more broadly, the pattern of relations between all organisms and their physical environment, not just humans, but all living things, whether animals or plants, what have you, all living organisms and their physical environment. And so, yes, it was here in this region, so seemingly inhospitable normally, that the first civilization would be constructed, the first ecology of civilization would be constructed. From desert dry to flood water wet, much more unpredictable than either the Nile or Indus Valley rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates were prone to violent flooding. And these could be catastrophic. The overwhelming power of nature to destroy whatever man had created. You see here, even today, in modern Iraq, in the Delta region, the so-called marsh Arabs, who still live on these tiny little postage stamp-sized plots of land that barely stretch their head above the great water flows. To have a riverboat, is as essential to moving about as an automobile or a bicycle or even a pair of of shoes would be today. And it's a great illustration, again, of man's ingenuity in creating an ecology of civilization. No wonder this civilization bore epic stories of great floods. You're looking here at a piece of baked clay containing cuneiform, what we call cuneiform writing, the earliest form of human writing preserved, cuneiform, on a baked clay tablet that in this case tells the story of a great flood, what scholars call the Babylonian flood epic, which relates a story similar to the story of Noah's flood as recounted in the biblical book of Genesis. Now get this, such Babylonian flood epics were common to the pre-biblical storytelling traditions of Sumer. In other words, these stories predate the biblical story of Noah and the flood, and as most scholars understand, were part of a tradition of storytelling in southern Mesopotamia, whereby the forces of nature, including the floodwaters, could have devastating effect on the humans and their ecology of civilization. Sometimes we assume in the West that the biblical stories are somehow the oldest stories. They're not even the oldest stories of this particular region of the world, and much more likely actually reflect the storytelling traditions that eventually inspired their telling as well. Another great Mesopotamian storytelling tradition is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which tells the story of a hero's journey beyond the gates at Earth's End, where the hero Gilgamesh will meet Utnapishtim, the man whom the gods selected to survive the great flood with his family and, quote, the seed of all living creatures. And here's an early Mesopotamian carved relief showing Utnapishtim on an elevated platform as he is surrounded by attendants and servants. And this man, this archetypal figure who will find his counterpart in the Judeo story of Noah, in a very similar story of a man who was chosen by gods to survive the great flood and to take along with him the animals of the earth so that they may survive the seed of all living creatures. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which dates to as much as 1,000 years before the earliest known biblical stories are composed, the story of Gilgamesh reflects then this ecology of civilization, living in a world where nature made its own demands. Okay, we're going to stop here with part one of the civilizations lecture, having just sort of approached the doorstep of Mesopotamia and the civilization of Sumer. In part two, we'll come back and look more closely at how civilization played out in Mesopotamia among the city-states of Sumer. And then in part three, we'll finish off with a look at ancient Egypt.